Good evening, everybody. My name is Vincent Southerland. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law here at NYU School of Law. And part of the center's work focuses on the implications for racial justice and inequality that can be found at the intersection of algorithmic tools, the criminal legal system, and other systems that govern our lives. I also serve as the criminal justice area lead for AI Now, and it's because of both of those roles, I'm really thrilled to be part of this evening's conversation with our panelists, both of whom are at the forefront of work being done on AI and automated decision systems at a time of rising austerity, inequality, and quite frankly, turmoil. So please join me in welcoming Virginia Eubanks, a professor of political science at SUNY Albany and author of the breakthrough book, Automating Inequality, and Philip Alston, who is a professor of law at NYU Law and is the UN Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. So, Philip, let me start with you. In your UN report on extreme poverty in the United States, it was the first in such a venue to really include AI in the conversation about inequality. Why was it important for you to do that in this report?
Well, my focus is on the human rights dimensions of these issues. In the AI area, we're well accustomed to talking about inequality, relating it to the impact of automation, the gig economy, and a range of other issues, but I don't think the human rights dimension comes in very often. I tend to see it in something of macro-micro terms. If you're looking at inequality, then it's a macro focus. What sort of major government policies or other policies can we adjust in order to improve the overall situation? But if you do a human rights focus, then you're really going down to the grassroots. You're looking at the rights of the individual who is being discriminated against, usually for a whole range of different reasons, or who's simply been neglected. And I think one of the problems is that there's neglect on both sides, that the AI people are not focused on human rights. There's a great tendency to talk about ethics, which of course is undefined and unaccountable, very convenient. And on the human rights side, there is a tendency to say this stuff is all outside our expertise and not to really want to engage with it. So in my report on the United States, done at the end of last year, I made a big effort to try to link the issues of inequality, human rights, and the uses of AI.
Great. And so I have a question for both of you, and maybe Virginia can start with this one.
I want to respond to Philip.
Well, go ahead and respond.
So I can't not talk to Philip. This report was so important, and I think it's so crucial to, particularly to movement organizing in the poor people's movement, to have this kind of vision of the United States with 43 million poor and working folks who are really struggling to meet their needs day to day, and are finding that these new tools often create more barriers for them than lowering those barriers. And one of the things that I think is so important about what Philip just said is that we often, particularly in my work in public services, these tools get integrated sort of under the wire in a way, because we see them as just being administrative changes and not as these consequential political decisions. But we absolutely have to reject that narrative that these things are just creating efficiencies, they're just optimizing systems. We are making a profound political decision every time we say, for example, we have to triage. We don't have enough resources, and so we have to make really hard decisions, and so these tools will help us make those decisions. Like, that's already a political choice that buys into this idea that there's not enough for everyone, and we live in a world of abundance and there's plenty for everyone.
Right.
So I think that's so important to point out, so I just wanted to respond.
Yeah. Well,
thank you.
Applause lines are fine.
Applause is good.
Applause is good. But what does that look like on the ground? Like, what types of things are you seeing? What types of things you've seen over the last year? What do you see kind of going forward that really kind of scares you when we think about automation and inequality and that relationship between the two?
Yeah, and Philip and I had a conversation about this a little bit earlier today, and I think one of the things we talked some about was how important it is to be listening to people who are facing the most direct consequences of these systems directly. I think sometimes we tend to talk about these systems as if the harm might potentially come sometime in the future in this abstract way, in this thought experiment kind of way. But the reality is these systems have been integrated into public assistance at least since the early 70s, and they're having effects on people right now in really profound material ways. So for folks who aren't familiar with the book, Automating Inequality, what I do is for the last 8 years, but more intensely the last 3 years, have looked at the way that new automated decision systems are being integrated across public service programs in the United States. And I look at three in the book. One is an attempt to automate and privatize all of the eligibility processes for the welfare system in Indiana. One is an electronic registry of the unhoused called the Coordinated Entry System in Los Angeles. And the third is a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county where Pittsburgh is in Pennsylvania. And what I saw is, despite the fact that there are some incredible potentials to integrate services, to lower barriers, to provide easier access to social services in this country, because these tools are built on this, what I think of as like the deep social programming of the United States, which is deep economic division, a deep and long history of murderous racial discrimination, that rather than creating tools to ease the burden of applying for public assistance, we're creating tools that divert people from the resources they need, they're legally entitled to, and they need to survive and protect their families. That the tools often criminalize people as part of their process of deciding who is deserving enough to get access to their basic human rights. And then in the end, all the data that's collected through those processes are used to create crystal balls about who's going to be risky in the future in order to rationalize denying them resources now. So that's sort of the big picture of what I saw across my research. In the last year, I think one of the things that stands out most to me as being really important to pay attention to is if you look in the 2019 federal budget, the Trump administration budget, that budget says that they're going to save $188 billion over the next 10 years by increasing data collection and analysis in middle-class entitlement programs. So I looked at welfare, I looked at homeless services, I looked at child welfare. These are mostly programs that are really only poor and working people interact with them, but now they're talking about disability and Social Security and unemployment. And so it very much seems like poor and working people have been sort of the canaries in the coal mine, the experimental population for these tools, and they're now looking to implement them on everyone.
Yeah, and what about you, Philip? What types of things have you seen kind of over your work or going forward that it really gives you pause and cause for concern?
Well, I mean, I'd echo what Virginia said a moment ago in terms of both of the points she made. First of all, I think it is extremely important, particularly for an audience interested in AI, to recognize that to the extent that we take a social welfare system, a system for social protection, and think that we can simply put on top of that AI-type techniques which will make it more efficient, more effective, and so on, what we're doing is doubling down on injustices in a great many ways, because the system is based on racial discrimination, is based on gender discrimination, is based on discrimination against nationalities, and so on, a whole range of different problems which are not being addressed. And the people who are promoting most the efficiency motif are those who want to slash the programs. So I think there is an affirmative responsibility on AI people not to say, hey, we're just the tech people, what can we do for you? Where do we put our product? You've got to start thinking proactively, how can we build this in? How can we point out to those who are hiring us what the existing problems are? And the second point, of course, I think is very straightforward. As Virginia said, what we're going to see, it's going to come to a theatre near you, in fact, a house near you, in fact, your apartment, before too long. Because after the midterm elections, what the administration has been doing in the last 2 years is to build up this massive deficit. And we know there's only one way available to solve that deficit. It's going to be cutting middle-class entitlements. And all of the all of the pioneering experiments that are being done on the poor right now are soon going to be ratcheted up because there have to be massive savings. That's the only place it can come from. You guys are going to be paying for the tax cuts, and we're going to see it in all of the services that are available to us on a regular basis. So I see a year that has been more or less a lead-up, tax cut on tax cut, and tax cuts can only go in one direction, that you have absolutely miserable public services, social services. You have a much greater burden placed on women in particular, because they're the ones who always have to pick up the slack when the state pulls back. And there's just going to be this huge push to say it's unavoidable. We're sorry, it's got to happen.
Right. And so, Philip, if we were, I mean, you mentioned earlier on about kind of taking a human rights approach or human rights framework. What would that look like if we were talking about AI and automation to kind of push back against some of this stuff?
Well, I mean, I think talking to an American audience, one has to be a little bit sensitive about talking about what we in the rest of the world, call social rights. In other words,
the right to eat, the right to live in a house.
Are you a communist?
I have been accused of this in the past.
Next thing she'll be talking about a right to healthcare, but I'm not going to go down that sort of road. So, I mean, I think if we take the standard American rights and the Bill of Rights and so on, you've obviously got a whole range of non-discrimination issues. But you've also got equal protection, due process, and so on. All of those rights are heavily implicated. And I think at present, to go back and repeat the point I made earlier, what I always see in the AI literature these days is ethics. I want to strangle ethicists. No, I shouldn't say that. I'm a human rights person. But no, and I don't really mean it, but it is true that ethics are completely open-ended. You can create your own ethic. But human rights, you can't. They're in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights. They've been interpreted by courts. There are certain limits. And until we start bringing those into the AI discussion, there's no hard anchor.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that's really important that I heard over and over again when I was doing the reporting for the book, from the point of view of administrators and designers of these tools, was they would say to me that these systems are, potentially regrettable but necessary systems of triage. That we just don't have enough resources, we have to make these really difficult decisions, and these tools help us make them more fairly. And again, this is one of those political decisions I was talking about at the top of our conversation, which is triage is actually really bad language to use to describe what we're doing, because triage assumes that there are more resources coming. And if there aren't more resources coming, then what we're doing is not actually triaging, we're not diagnosing, we're rationing. And so we should call it what it is, which is we are automating systems of rationing resources, of rationing people's access to our shared, our shared wealth. And I think it's incredibly important to think beyond these values of efficiency and optimization to some of these principles that are enshrined in the economic human rights, the Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and other things. And as an American, I can also say that I don't care if we've signed on the dotted line. I'm willing to say that as a political community, we're allowed at any time to say there is a line below which nobody goes for any reason. That nobody starves to death in the United States, that nobody sleeps on the street in a tent for 10 years in the United States, and that no family is broken up because they can't afford a child's medication, right? I feel like that's pretty baseline stuff. And I think one of the things we need to do before we see better tools is to get there, is to get our sort of souls right around what we're doing to each other.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm wondering kind of how does this trend toward automation fit into the larger historical trend around automation and inequality? I mean, can you speak to that at all? This doesn't seem like the first time this ever happened where technology has squeezed people.
Yeah, so I use this metaphor in the book of the digital poorhouse. And I do that really intentionally because I feel like the tools that I'm seeing in public services are really more evolution than revolution. and that the sort of deep social programming of these tools goes way, way back in our history, at least as far as the actual brick and mortar poorhouse. And the reason that that moment's really important is, so there was this huge economic depression, the 1819 depression. Economic elites got really freaked out because poor people were organizing and demanding things like food and houses. So they did what economic elites do, and they commissioned a bunch of studies. And the question that the studies were supposed to answer is, what's the problem? Is it poverty, the lack of resources, or is it what they called at the time pauperism, which is dependence on public benefits? Does anyone want to guess what they decided, what the reports came back? The latter, yeah. So they decided the problem was the dependence on public benefits, not poverty itself. And so they built these brick and mortar institutions that basically the trade-off was, if you're going to request public services, you have to move into the poorhouse in order to receive them. And this is 1820, so not everybody had these rights, but you had to give up your right to vote, your right to hold office, your right to marry, and often your children in order to enter the poorhouse. And the death rates of some of these institutions was something like 30% annually. So a third of people who went in every year died. So this was no joke. This is a really horrifying institution in many ways. And I really think this is the moment in our history that we decided social service programs' first and most important job is to do a kind of moral diagnosis, to decide whether or not you're deserving enough of help, rather than going in the direction of universal floors, which is what happened in many places around the world, but not here. And so that feels to me like the very deep programming that underlies these new tools. And if we don't explicitly address it by instituting sort of equity gears in this machine, then we're just going to amplify and speed up those processes.
And I'm wondering kind of where does race fit into all this? Because I know we've touched on it a little bit here, but I'm curious, Philip and Virginia, how does race kind of exacerbate some of these problems, particularly when we think about automation and inequality?
So do you want to start? Because I'd love your structural racism stuff in the report.
All right, thanks. I think there's a very close relationship between race and attitudes to welfare. There are lots of studies that have been done of looking at the media, and of course as soon as you talk about poverty, you've got a photo of a black family, because they're the ones who are poor, they're the ones who are trying to basically live off we whites, and therefore we're not going to let this happen. I think those narratives are carefully interwoven, and a lot of the effort to try to stigmatize welfare, stigmatize what I prefer to call social protection, is motivated by these racial stereotypes, which are fairly constant. One of the issues, and Virginia and I talked about this briefly earlier, is that when I started doing the research, I started to look for indicators of class in the US. And by that, I boiled it down very simply to looking at whether income statistics had been matched with different groups and so on. And of course, there's very little of that, because suddenly race comes in there, that's the sole factor. So to the extent that other people are poor, that's not the main focus. And that's good in some ways, because the heritage of racial inequality is so deep and so powerful. But it's also bad because it's, again, sort of stereotyping it. This is something for the black community. It's not for the whole community. And that's part of the whole them and us mentality, which, of course, is central to the whole welfare area, that those people, mainly black, are not contributing. They're not taxpayers, whereas I, of course, being white, am a taxpayer, and I'm not going to put up with supporting these people.
Yeah.
So we've got to really move beyond all those narratives, but see the interlinkages.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting because in both of your work, you both make this distinction between kind of the deserving and undeserving beneficiaries of some support, and I think that also tracks along racial lines. I'm curious though, What's your response to people?
Yeah, so like one of the most important places that this comes in, and it's so important to keep our eye on this, is, Philip was talking earlier about how often these systems are rationalized around efficiency and optimization, around these ideas of austerity. There's not enough, we need to be more efficient. But the other reason that administrators and designers give is that these are systems for combating bias, particularly racial bias. And I think it's really crucial to acknowledge that the public service system in the United States has had a deep and lasting problem with racial inequality. Basically, discriminatory eligibility rules blocked nearly all people of color from receiving public benefits in this country from 1935, when they were established, to 1970, when the welfare rights movement fought back and won against discriminatory eligibility. So one of the things that folks will tell you around why we should move to these tools is because it makes it possible to identify discriminatory patterns of decision making and pull it out of the system. So it's a bias fighting machine. So the problem with this narrative is that the assumption is that there's no bias in the computer, which we all, I think this is an audience that knows that we build our biases into machines just as we build them into our children. And also, the problem is about the way bias gets defined in these systems. So in the automated decision-making systems that I worked with, that I reported on, bias there was only understood as like an irrational choice made by an individual. It wasn't understood as a systemic and structural factor. So let me just give you a concrete example. So in Allegheny County, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, Allegheny County, like just about every other place in the United States, has a serious problem with racial disproportionality in their foster care system. Something like 38% of kids in foster care are Black or biracial, and they're only something like 18% of the youth population in the county. So they're at least twice as represented as they should be in that system. So the designers of the Allegheny Family Screening Tool told me, one of the things we can do is keep an eye on these intake screeners who receive reports of abuse and make sure they're not making discriminatory decisions about who gets screened in for a full investigation and who doesn't. The problem is that the county's own research shows that almost all of this disproportion, all of this discrimination is actually entering at a totally different point in the process. So it's not entering at the point where caseworkers are screening calls, it enters at the point at which the community is calling on families. It comes in at referral. So the community reports Black and biracial families 3.5 times more often than white families, so 350%. Once that case gets to intake case screeners, there's a little bit of additional discrimination that's added. So screeners screen in 69% of cases around Black and biracial families and only 65% of cases around white families. But the reality is the great majority is coming in from community referral. And that's not necessarily a data amenable problem. That's a cultural problem. That's a problem around what does a good family look like? And in the United States, that family looks rich and white. And one of the problems with this is if you're removing frontline discretion from that system, you're actually removing their ability to correct for that massive overrepresentation that comes in at call referral. So what we're doing is using the idea of eliminating individual irrational bias to allow this sort of vast structural bias to sort of sneak in the back door of the system. And I think that's really, really dangerous.
Gotcha. So, I guess that kind of brings me to one other question. Like, is there a way to use these types of tools, these kind of automated systems in some way for good? I think you both write about kind of the coordinated entry system dealing with homelessness in LA County. Which I think you describe as like the Match.com of homeless services.
That's how they describe it.
That's how they describe it. I'm not sure. That's not how you describe it. That's how they describe it. Is there a way to kind of use these systems for good, so to speak? And if so, what do we have to do in order to make that happen? Or what do solutions look like, I guess, generally is a better way of asking the question. Philip, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
My problem is that, as someone said to me, a homeless person said to me in LA, the solution to my problem doesn't lie in tech, it lies in a house. But it's true. In other words, the basic political decision to provide more money for housing is absent. We're not prepared to pay for these losers, down and out, refuse to work, dirty people to get any sort of housing. So they're off the agenda. That's it. If you start with that, and that's where I think we are, no amount of good intentions, such as the coordinated entry system and so on, saying, okay, we're really going to do this scientifically, we're going to bring in every possible factor, and the decision maker is going to know exactly how to distinguish among the three of us who's the most deserving, etc. The problem is you've got to address that underlying political problem and not think that tech can solve it.
Yeah. So just a similar quote from Gary Blasi, one of the folks that I spoke to when I was in Los Angeles. He said, homelessness isn't a systems engineering problem, it's a carpentry problem. And I think that's one of the best lines in the book. I think I often find myself in rooms where it feels like what people want is a 5-point plan for building better technology. And I think there's a lot of room to do that work. I think that's important work. I am also really comfortable spoiling that notion by saying, right, we have some really deep work to do. I think we really have to change the story around poverty in the United States, the narrative we tell. The narrative we tell is that it's an aberration, that it's probably just this small percentage of really pathological people. It is in fact the majority experience in the United States. 51% of us will be below the poverty line at some point in our adult life. 2/3 of us will access means-tested public assistance, that's straight welfare. And I think creating space for people to see themselves within the identity of poor as a political identity is really an important part of that work. That's incredibly difficult work because it means you also have to address race, and you also have to address gender, and you also have to address migration. You have to do all of those things at the same time. It's super hard work, but it's change-making, critical, unsettling, important work. I think we need to move towards political systems that act more like universal floors than like moral thermometers. And in the meantime, we have to create technologies that do less harm. So like one of the gut check questions I tend to ask engineers and designers is, does this tool increase the self-determination and dignity of the people it targets, right? Of poor and working people specifically. And then if it was aimed at anyone but poor and working people, would it be tolerated at all? And if the answer to that is no, then it's unacceptable from the point of view of democracy.
Great. Well, I think now we can kind of transition to a question from the Twitter sphere.
Hi, Twitter sphere.
And maybe, Phil, this might be directed to you, and I think, Virginia, you could probably weigh in on this as well. What's kind of happening internationally with these types of issues? What's happening kind of around the globe?
I think, what I see from my vantage point is an extraordinary similarity. I did this official UN visit to the US at the end of last year. At the end of this month, I'm doing a similar mission to the United Kingdom. I'll be there for 2 weeks, going to all parts of the country and so on. So I'm currently totally immersed in UK welfare policy and the role that AI is playing in that. I also happen to be Australian, and I see exactly what's happening in Australia. And in those three countries, which are similar in many ways, but also very different in others, we see exactly the same sort of trends. We see the same phenomena in terms of treating welfare, I shouldn't call them that, people like most of us who at some stage need forms of social protection that only governments can provide. I see them being demonized, I see them being stigmatized. I see policies which keep saying the solution, forgive my Australianism, you lazy bastard, is to get out and work. It's employment. It's not welfare. It's not government assistance. But of course, what we're seeing is that even in a full employment economy, and most of those three are, the sort of jobs that are being created are not just very precarious in many cases, but very often, by design, do not offer enough income in order for those people to survive. So there are tens of thousands of American military people who are on food stamps. There are 1.5 million retired military people on food stamps. And I met with loads of workers for Walmart and various others who work full-time but need food stamps. And so the narrative which is trying to demonize these people is really problematic. But I just want to say one other thing, which is when you said, what is the role of AI? Virginia and I both answered, well, you've got to go back to basics. You've got to have a serious commitment to welfare before AI can do much. But of course, that's not the answer for this audience, because AI is going to be there. And you can either exacerbate the trends that are going on, or you can call attention to them. You can build in ways of highlighting what the difficulties are, building in ways that highlight the gaps and the vacuums. That's what's got to be done, as much as the more creative and innovative ways that you're currently working on.
So one of the ways that I tend to try to describe the solution is, we have a tendency to think that designing in neutral is designing fairly. But in fact, designing in neutral gives us no gears to deal with the actual hills and valleys and twists and turns of the landscape that we live in, which is deeply riven with inequalities, right? So it's like building a car with no gears and sitting it at the top of a hill in San Francisco, and then somehow being surprised when it crashes at the bottom of the hill, right? So for me, it's about building those equity gears into these systems from the beginning on purpose, bit by bit and bite by bite. And I think a big part of that is really speaking directly to the folks who are going to be most impacted by these systems. I think their voices are too rarely in rooms like this, of the folks who see themselves as targets of these systems. And I think they have the best information about them. And I think they're also the most likely to be accountable for good solutions, good lasting solutions.
Yeah, the idea that people who are closest to the problem are most likely to have the best solutions.
Yeah.
It really comes to mind there. One really quick thing, just to wrap up. It seems like kind of automation really undermines the empathy that we need in order to kind of drive home solutions to some of these problems. Would you agree with that? Is that something that you've seen in your work?
Yes, so one of the things I talk about in the book is this, one of my great fears is that these systems act as kind of empathy overrides. They sort of act as this relief valve, allowing us to sort of outsource the most difficult decisions we face as a political community to technology. And again, we see that then as an administrative solution, not a political choice. I really think we need to sit with the fact that we're making these choices based on the assumption that there is natural austerity, there's not enough for anyone, and there's nothing we can do. We just absolutely have to challenge that, recognize that we're making political choices, and move on from there.
Philip, any last word?
I think Virginia's book is absolutely superb in terms of the stories that she tells, the stories that she brings from the ground to really highlight what's going on, and that brings a dimension which is not able to be got otherwise. But the other point she makes about compassion being central to it, you can, as we're doing across the world, privatize a lot of social provision and so on, but you're turning it over to companies that then want to just have a set of boxes to tick. It's not, so tell me, Virginia, how's your husband doing? What's the problem with the children? Is that getting any better? How can I factor that in? And that's what social protection and welfare are really all about, and they can't be done by automation.
Great. Well, join me in thanking our two wonderful panelists.